Hi there, this is going to be a walkthrough of how I make these ridiculous looking nCloth people. It won't be anything too descriptive about nCloth, it won't be a huge demo on like CFX mastery or anything like that. This is purely goofing around in Maya, just a walkthrough showing how I do it. It's going to be very unpolished, really sloppy, pretty stupid, but I'm using Maya 2020, the educator's copy or the student license. You can use any version of Maya that has nCloth, I believe. The only difference might be some of the, menu locations and things like that. It shouldn't be too hard. This is probably like an upper beginner or lower intermediate type of walkthrough. So, hang on. Okay, first step is to bring in some content. Now, you can make your own or you can get some online, whatever you want to do. But this is the easiest way to learn this exercise. So I'm going to go to the Windows General Editors Content Browser. And in here is a bunch of stuff. So under the examples folder, animation, motion capture, FBX, there's a bunch of clips. And I'm going to grab this rebound one, right click on it and go to import. And this will give me something that should be really good for playing around with nCloth. It's a person running, a giant skeleton. It runs and then it kind of jumps up like that, and then it runs out of frames. It just stops. That's great because this is where we want the nCloth to take over. So I'm just going to limit my timeline to 120 frames. That's probably all I need for what I'm going to do. And I need to create a bind pose at the start. This is going to be so that I can connect my nCloth to the animation. You'll see when we get there, but trust me, this is something we got to do. So I'm going to go first and select all by type joints. This gives me the whole FK skeleton of the mocap. And then I'm going to use the middle mouse button and the shift key to highlight all of the keyframes and drag them forward about 10 frames. So now we have sort of dead space at the start of the timeline, and then at frame 10 it starts to move. And on frame 1, I'm going to create a bind pose. The way I do this is I just zero out all the rotation on all of the joints at that frame. So left click, drag in the timeline here, sorry, not the timeline, the channel box, and then 0. So with 0 set for the rotations, it's auto keying that, by the way. I have this kind of transition now from a bind pose to the running. So to make sure that it's really keyed there, I can just key the whole thing and hit the S key, but I'm using auto key. The other thing I probably need to have is some ground. So I'm using spacebar and go into the marking menu, and I'll go to polygon primitives, and I'm going to choose a disk, but you can use whatever you want for the ground. If I scale this up so that it fills the space where this skeleton is running, this is going to help us when we put the nCloth in there and it needs to fall and flop around on the ground. But it also helps us to see at the start that the skeleton is sort of through the floor. So what I need to do is just raise it up on that frame 1. So I select the root and then hit W for transform and lift it up a little bit above the ground. It doesn't need to be flush with the ground or anything like that. It just needs to be above the ground for the sort of bind pose. So once I've done that, if I scrub through now, it should never go through the floor, which is great. Perfect. Okay. So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to label the ground. Helps us to keep things clear later on. I'm also going to freeze the transformations on it. And I'm going to put it in a layer. Delete the history. It's just good to be clean with this stuff. Makes life easier. So I'll just call the layer ground layer. There we go. And maybe I'll smooth that out a little bit. Hit the 3 key. There we go. Okay, so we got a nice smooth ground. Great. So now step 2 is actually to bring in the rig. So back to the content browser. And if I go to rigs, here it is. There's the Jaina Human IK rig. This is something that it's not really the best rig in the world, but it's pretty straightforward and pretty clean, easy to use. So the next step is to bring in a rig. And if I go to the General Editor's Content Browser again and make sure that I'm on the rigs side of it, you can see there are these human IK rigs. I'm going to bring in this Jaina one, right click on it, import, pops in pretty quick, and then you can see there's this human IK rig. You can animate it yourself, but what we want to do is we want to attach this mocap for this exercise. Just makes things a little faster. So if I go into the Windows, Animation Editors, Human IK, we get this interface. The character you can see here, it says it's rebound 1, but we want to set that to Jaina. And then you can see right now, Jaina, the character, is being controlled by the source, this control rig. So like I was saying before, if you want, you can keyframe that. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to swap the source to rebound 1, which is the mocap. And then you can see she pops over to the mocap. And now Jaina is moving. There's some funkiness with this. Don't be put off. It's basically just that most of the time when you're putting mocap on a rig, there's a solver involved, which takes into account the differences in proportions. So like if your rig is for a little weird troll character and your mocap is from you, the proportions probably won't be the same. And that's what's going on here. The proportions of this rig don't match the mocap. So it's a little bit offset, but it's close enough. It does what we need. I'm just going to hide the joints now so we don't need to look at that. Everything's working just fine so far. Now, a couple other things I want to do just to make, like I said, life a little easier. I'm going to create some layers. So let's take all of the Jaina stuff and make a layer for it, a display layer, that is. So we'll call this the Jaina rig layer. And then the rest of this stuff is fine. I don't think we really need a display layer for the rebound reference. We've pretty much hidden it anyway. So we're in good shape. We need to now create some proxies. This is where it gets a little bit funky, just because we want the nCloth to iterate quickly. And if we try to put nCloth on the mesh as it is, it's a little bit complicated. Like there's eyeball meshes, there's teeth and gums and stuff like that. So we're going to create something simpler for nCloth to simulate with. And the way we do that is if we open up this Jaina rigged HIK rig thing here, you can see there's her skin. And I'm going to duplicate this. So I'll go under Edit and I'll go to Duplicate Special because we don't want to just duplicate it. We want to duplicate it and put it under the world as opposed to keeping it in the hierarchy there. So I'm going to hit Duplicate Special. Out pops a duplicate of Jaina. And then I'm going to hide the whole Jaina rig thing because we have the display layer. So now we just have this model floating around here. And we can't move it or do anything because it's locked. Because the source that we duplicated it from was rigged. And usually the skin gets locked when you rig something. So I'm going to highlight all of that, right click and unlock it. And for some reason, I don't know what it is, you have to unlock this one twice. So I'm going to do that. Unlock. You can make sure all the history is deleted from it. So it's nice and clean. Now if I scripted the timeline, it's not moving. So we know that this is just the model that we duplicated from the rig. And here's where you'll see why this is kind of a necessity. So this model is actually multiple models in one. There's eyeballs, like I said, there's teeth and gums, you can see them in there. And if I go to Mesh, Separate under the modeling menu, it breaks it all apart. And we're going to just delete the eyes and teeth and gums because we don't need them. So, boom, gone. Now we just have her skin by itself. And we need to reduce this. So I'm going to get rid of the mouth bag, which is not a very elegant name, I know. But there's this, basically a mouth, pocket, the inside of the mouth. And to get rid of that, we just need to sort of select some faces on there. So like I'm going to select two faces at the back of it, and then using Shift and the right caret key, I can expand my selection. I'll keep expanding the selection until it gets to the sort of edge of the inside of the mouth, and then I'll delete those faces. There we go. So now we've gotten rid of the mouth bag, we've gotten rid of the eyes, we got rid of the teeth and gums. And here we have this soulless monster. And all I need to do now is close up those holes, because otherwise nCloth kind of freaks out a little bit. So I'm going to close up these holes. It's very simple. I go to Mesh, I go to Fill Hole, and it'll close up those holes. Now I'm going to delete the history off this lady. And we need to do one last thing. Now, we don't need to. If you want, you can use this as your nCloth and as your proxy. That's fine. It'll work. But if you want to get optimum performance, you'll want to reduce it a little bit more. So I'm going to be sneaky and cheat. I have a demo of this cool quad remesher. It's like a plugin for Maya that does polygon reduction. So I'm going to use this. I have a target quad count of 200 and an adaptive size of 100. And that's going to give me something that's much reduced from the original mesh. So I'll hit remesh it. Oh, I have to select something first. So there we go. Hit remesh, takes a moment, and then it gives you this low poly, proxy of what she was. And gets rid of the face, which you really don't need for what we're doing, because we're just doing this body sort of sim. I'm going to put the old material back onto this, just a Lambert, so we see this. I can close that. And the plugin is nice. It gives you sort of like, there's the original hidden, and here's the new one. I'm going to unparent that new one, and I'm going to call it, we'll call this one nCloth proxy. Oops. And I always put PLY on things that are polygons. It's just a way for me to keep things organized. I'm going to duplicate that. We're going to call the duplicate wrap proxy, PLY. So now we have the nCloth and the wrap, and they're both the exact same thing. And the way that this is going to help us is it's going to give us something that is very easy to simulate and something that we can wrap to the original motion. So that's the next step. Here we go. First, I'm going to put these in layers too to make life a little easier. So for the nCloth proxy, create an nCloth proxy layer. Good. And for the wrap, create a wrap proxy layer. Now none of this is moving, so what we want to do is we actually want the wrap layer to match what the actual animation is doing. And the way we do that is we use a wrap deformer. So if I go back to frame 0 here, you select the wrap proxy, you select the rigged mesh, and you go to rigging or animation, you go to deform, and then you choose wrap. So the wrap thing is basically going to make sure that our wrap follows the motion. So you can see the nCloth is still back there. That's good. I'm just going to hide it for a second. And if we turn on the Jaina rig layer, you can see that these two line up perfectly. And it's because we created this T-pose that we're able to get a clean wrap deformation. So great, that's all good. We can hide the Jaina rig layer again. And there we go. This is what we're going to use to drive motion into the nCloth. So now that we've done all this, we can actually hide the wrapper and go just to the nCloth and start doing some testing with nCloth. So to create an nCloth scenario here, I'm going to select the ground plane, and under the effects menu, I'm going to choose nCloth, create passive collider. And that basically just turns this, this ground plane into something hard that the nCloth can fall on. And then I'm going to turn this nCloth proxy into nCloth. So I just go to create nCloth. And what you can do right out of the gates is, go to frame 0 and hit play. And it'll start simulating. You can see it's just slowly falling, really slowly. And that's because of the scale. So if I go back to frame 0 and select the nucleus and hit Control A to go to the attribute editor for it, you can see here under the nucleus there is a scale attributes. I'm going to change this. I'm going to change the time scale to 2, which basically doubles how quick things go. I'm going to change the space scale to 0.1. So if I close that up and play now, you can see it sims way faster. And that actually looks pretty fun. Maybe we should just have her do that. I don't know. But usually what I do is I play around with this to see if I can get something a little bit more interesting. You can play with the dynamic properties by, increasing stretch resistance or decreasing it. Let's try decreasing it just to see what happens. We'll decrease the compression resistance. And then we'll close that up and play with it again. So you can see like the head really loses its shape almost immediately, and it just bloop goes all over the place. One of the other things that I've done is I've played with the pressure. So like if you switch it from manual pressure and you switch it to volume tracking, and then turn up the incompressibility, turn that up to like 20, and then set the start pressure to something like, I don't know, set it to 1. Pressure damping, set it to 0.2. 0.1, I guess, is what I'll set it to. And then I'll go back to first frame and play it again. You can see it sort of puffs out, like it inflates. It drops down like a balloon, and it sort of puffs out as if, air is being pushed into the head and the upper torso. So I thought that was fun. That's what I was doing. Let's start with that anyways, right? So go back to frame 1 or frame 0. And now how do we connect this? Well, it's not hard at all. We just have to turn back on our wrap proxy, and then we select the wrap proxy, and we select the nCloth. We go to component mode, make sure that we're selecting poly vertices. We drag select over all of them, and then we go to nConstraint. And what we want to do is a component to component constraint. So I'll hit that, creates this little weird dot, but if you play it now, you'll see all of the vertices have a constraint. And what the constraints are doing, they're just like the cloth is still trying to solve, but it's sticking it to that wrap proxy. So this is really great. Seeing all those things lit up is kind of a distraction, so I'm going to hide them. Select the dynamic constraint and just hide it. And you can also see what's going on here. It's kind of creepy. There's a lot of stuff breaking. So the collision is still happening even though the dynamic constraint is on. So we want to make sure that it doesn't have to solve for collisions while the dynamic constraint is on there, and we don't want the cloth doing anything. So like, let's say we want the cloth to take over from around frame 43. What I can do then is I can have the cloth simulation. If I select the nCloth and go to the attribute editor, there's a collision strength attribute here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just middle click on frame 40 and set this value to 0. So if I just type in 0 and then right click and set a key, there we have collide strength 0 on frame 40. And then middle click on frame 43 and set the collide strength back to 1. It auto keys it. Now if I simulate this, we should see something a little less munged up and creepy looking. So you see there's no real freaking out there anymore. At least it shouldn't be until frame 40. Yeah. So now the other thing we need to do is we need to keyframe the cloth into action, or more to the point, we need to turn off the dynamic constraint. So if I select the dynamic constraint, go back to frame 40, and keyframe this. So choose the attribute editor again, Control A. And you can see there's a strength attribute, there's a glue strength. We can key either of these. I'm going to use the glue strength because it's more of an absolute. I think I get a more fun result when I keyframe this. I'm going to set this glue strength, keyframe it at 1 on frame 40, and then on 43 we're going to turn it off. And the funny stuff that's going on back here, don't worry about it. It's just because we're stepping through and it's not getting to evaluate the simulation. But if we go back to frame 0 and hit play, it'll evaluate. So now I can turn this attribute editor back off, go back to frame 0 and hit play. And we should see the cloth take over at frame 43, somewhere between 40 and 43. So there it goes. You can see it turns on and it does its crazy stuff. It just flies off. If I zoom out, yeah, you can see it's doing wacky stuff. And we still have the wrap turned on. We can turn that off. And there it is. So now we can play with the sim a little bit more, see if it's what we want or if we want to do something slightly different. But we have all the timing set up of when the nCloth takes over. So it's kind of funny how it explodes and turns into this giant elastic empty bag. There's a lot of stuff you can do to make this do strange and fun things. Some of it will slow the simulation down a lot. Some of it will speed it up. I'm going to try right out of the gates. Let's try and do something where it's not quite as stretched out. So like, I'm going to go down to the pressure settings here again. I'm not going to have the incompressibility up so high. I'm going to turn that back down to 5. And then I'm going to go back to the stretch resistance. I'm going to turn this up to like 40. And the compression resistance, I'll turn that up to 20. And then we'll sim it again. So it doesn't quite stretch out as far as it used to. And it floats in the air there. Drops onto the ground. Goes over the edge. That's kind of fun. Bloop. So there's other stuff we can do too. We can play with the friction. And you can play with the friction on her or on the ground. Let's play with the friction on the ground first. We'll set it to 1, which is pretty high. It'll almost just stick there. We can put a little bounce into it if we want. We could set this to like 0.5. And then let's see what that does. I don't know that the bounce will actually do very much. Like I said, I'm not really an nCloth expert. I'm just kind of playing around. It's got a little bounce to it, and it sticks a little bit. We can also add stickiness to the model itself, which is probably going to be more effective. So like if I go to the collisions here and set the friction to 1, or even set, well, if I set stickiness, it'll kind of stick to itself a bit. Let's try it, 0.2. And then, yeah, let's play that. We'll put a little more bounce into this as well. 0.5, that's probably a lot. Let's see what happens. It's just disturbing. I think I like this one. Yeah, let's keep that. All right. So let's say we like this, but you can play with this till you're, blue in the face. The main thing is once you have something that you're kind of content with, you're going to want to cache it out. So you go to nCache and you go to create new cache, and I would go to the nObject and choose the little box next to it so you can make sure that the cache is going somewhere that you want it to. Mine is going into the folder that I've designated, the project folder I've designated, and I know that's okay. I know there's enough storage there, so it shouldn't be a problem. But caches are big. It's like lots and lots of data for every single frame, so you'll want to have enough hard drive space for it. So anyways, I'm going to hit create, and now what it does is basically writes every frame to the hard drive, so you don't have to keep simulating it. You can just play this and use it for wrapping to something that you're going to render. Boom, there it is. And now if I play, it's basically real time. Blink. So we've got everything cached and we are ready to wrap this up. And what I mean by wrap this up is I mean wrap this back onto the original model and light it. So this is kind of where it gets a little funky. You have a leftover node in here if you've done everything the same as me. This is from creating that sort of proxy, low-res proxy. So I'm just going to delete that because you can see it has the same name here as this. So I'll get rid of that. And then we're going to duplicate the original model, which is hidden. It's in this layer here. We're going to just duplicate that with duplicate special and put it out into the world, group under the world. We're going to rename it and call it render Jaina PLY since it's polygons. And then I'm going to unlock all this stuff again because every time you duplicate that rig, it's going to keep the locks on it. So unlock all that. And now I'm going to turn off the nCloth proxy layer. There it is. If I hit the 6 key, you can see it's got the textures. That's what we want to render. And so in order to have the motion on that, as you'll see, right, we have our cache there. We want to put the cached motion onto her. So we're going to use a wrap again. Now, it's not very complicated. It's the exact same process. But to make sure that this renders, we have to turn on a few things first. So if you go to the attribute editor for it, you'll see what happened is the poly shape node doesn't have any visibility turned on. That's a problem. You actually need primary visibility in order to render. I'm going to turn on everything except for holdout. And then I'm going to go over to the poly shape orig. I don't even know why that's still there. I'm going to turn all this stuff off just to make sure it's not rendering extra things. This is a remnant of all the weird duplications we've done. I'm not sure why it's all in there, but apparently it needs to be. So there we go. This will ensure now when I hit render, if we've got a light in here. So let's create a light, go to Arnold, create a sky dome, and then just hit render. Make sure I'm looking at RGB. Let's see, all channels. There it is. So she renders. Great. Now I just need to put that wrapper on there and we're golden. So I'm going to select that render Jenna, and then we're going to select the thing that we want to influence it with, which is the nCloth. And I'm going to go to rigging. You can use animation. Go under deform and go to wrap. And it's the exact same thing that we did before, only now it's affecting the shaded version. And there she goes. So happy day. And if you want, you can sort of, hit the 3 key on this so it subdivides it, makes it look a little smoother. You can add more deformers if you want. You can even put a delta mush deformer on this and make it a little bit smoother yet. But I think it's probably working pretty well. By the way, there's this one last thing I forgot to mention. This is something that you can actually fine tune in the nCloth settings. But if you missed it like I did, it's no big deal to sort of tweak it after the fact. So what's going on here is if you scrub through your animation and look in like a side view, you'll notice that it doesn't actually land on that plane. Here, let me turn off the grid so you can see. So like the ground is there and it's landing just above it. And this has to do with this kind of, it's got a collision threshold, and you can change that. So like if you go in and look at the nCloth, you look at the collisions, right? So there's this thickness which you can play with, and that's because it's not using the actual faces perfectly. So you can tune that, or you can do what I'm about to do, which is to totally cheat. I go and I select the nCloth and I just keyframe it, right? So like here we are at frame, go to wireframe mode so you can see everything. We're at frame 82, and then it hits the ground around 84. I just keyframe it down. Boink. So like over a few frames, you get a little bit of extra movement, but nobody can tell. So there you go. And that's the cheat. And then I go over here and I play with the lights and do all kinds of silly things. And I basically render it out. So that's the demo.